Good day to you all, and thanks for joining us for our informative and hopefully valuable webinar on System Centre 2012, which is an overview and licensing. I'm Gary Byrne and I'm part of the solutions team here at Environ. So if and when you have a requirement for a new or upgraded system or one of our technology services, we may well reach to discuss your solution. Environ have planned that you have the ability to watch this webinar in real time or as a recording. So to ask questions, please email me at Environ at the address info@environ.co.uk, and myself or one of my colleagues will do our best to respond as soon as possible. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sean Taylor, your key speaker for this event. Sean is a highly experienced Microsoft solution architect and well placed to describe the features on which this webinar is focused and to answer all your technical queries. Thank you, Sean, and over to you.
Thank you, Gary. So this webinar is featuring System Centre 2012, which has also recently gone Service Pack 1. I've tried to include some of the key changes to Service Pack 1. The biggest product that's changed, without a shadow of a doubt, is System Centre Configuration Manager, which we've got coming up a little bit later on. But we're going to start off with Virtual Machine Manager. So for those of you who have been fortunate or unfortunate enough to view the Server 2012 one, I made reference to this with regards to management of the virtual machines, and the fact that it is predominantly wizard driven, where some of the functionality within Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V would require you to know, learn, find a significant amount of PowerShell commands. So they've made some significant changes with their System Centre Virtual Machine Manager 2012. First of all, again, for anyone that's deployed or has the previous version of the product, it is quite feasible that you may have virtualized the server that System Centre Virtual Machine Manager actually sits on top of. If you have quite sensibly put that in a cluster, you may already be aware of the fact that if you live migrate it, it'll get to 48%, fail catastrophically, and you'll have to rebuild it, which is a bit of a problem. So with this particular one, they've actually looked at that, they've taken on board the feedback, and the Virtual Machine Manager server is now highly available and can work in a cluster. So when it does disconnect and reconnect, there is no problem. Again, for those of you who've already got the product, there is an upgrade path. Again, unfortunately, there is a caveat, and the caveat to that is that you must be using full-blown SQL as your back end. The SQL Express version is no longer supported with the 2012 release version of the product. Custom properties take on a whole new meaning within Virtual Machine Manager 2012, and everything you do is based upon PowerShell, and there are a number of new PowerShell commands that go with VMM. But by far and away the thing that's changed the most, and this also is reinforced by Service Pack 1, is the change to fabric management. So previously you will have been used to Server 2008 and Virtual Machine Manager 2010, basically managing nothing more than your physical host and your virtual machines. And you can do a little bit with storage and you can do a little bit with networking, but it is somewhat restrictive. So the whole principle here is we've got the ability to manage not just the hosts that are providing the virtualization and the virtual machines that are providing your services, but actually the whole show, so the entire virtualized infrastructure, and that comes under the heading of Fabric. So we start off with things like bare metal provisioning. So Microsoft have got access to things like the ILO for HP and the DRAC for Dell. So I've got the ability to reliably, and that's a very important word, power on and power off servers. That goes doubly as far as new servers are concerned, because as part of my fabric management, I've actually got the ability to embed and manage my own Pixie Boot server, so that I can take a newly provisioned server, for example from Dell, I can plug it into my infrastructure, I can power it on because I've got access to the DRAC. I've then got the ability to Pixie Boot it, so it gets an IP address, it's WDS, Windows Deployment Services then goes, you don't want me, you want Virtual Machine Manager. And Virtual Machine Manager can actually deploy a sysprepped hard drive to that particular physical piece of tin, and you've built a new server and you've been nowhere near it. We've still got cross-platform Hyper-V and virtualization support, so we can plug into Hyper-V as you'd expect. We can also plug into VMware and also Citrix Xen Server. The network management is probably the thing that's changed the most within this product. So previously I could take a network card, I could virtualize it, I could allocate it to specific VLANs, and I could serve that up to my virtual machines, and that's pretty much as far as I could go. Now I've actually got the ability to create PVLANs, so private VLANs, and use those instead of the traditional VLAN. So if you take on a new customer or you want to put a virtual machine in a different part of your network, you'd spin it up, you create a new VLAN. It could get complicated very quickly. You could also start running out of numbers. With the PVLANs, it makes things significantly easier to manage. We've also got the ability to plug into it things like load balancers. So obviously there's the inbuilt Microsoft NLB, but then there are also proper hardware devices that we can plug in, and we can also manage that from within Virtual Machine Manager. We just need to provide an administrative account for the device that we want to manage. The same is true of storage management. So I've got the ability to plug into the vast majority of SAM deployments out there. Types really makes no difference. We connect in by using a standard set of protocols. We specify a run as account and an admin account for the actual piece of hardware that's providing the storage. Once we've done that, Virtual Machine Manager interrogates it, finds out all the information, pulls that through in the console, and allows you to manage it. Some of your SAN administrators might not like you doing that, so therefore they can provision it, I can just pull it through, and I can then apply that to my hosts or my virtual machines, or I can actually create new ones if I want to do so. And it very much depends on the account that you provide, having the appropriate permissions on the actual storage itself. We've also got update management. So rather than updating of virtual machines and hosts has always been a bit of a tricky subject because your Windows updates, if they're not thought through and deployed accordingly, can cause havoc with regards to your virtualized infrastructure. So what we've now got is within the Virtual Machine Manager console, we've actually got the ability to implement our own dedicated update server that plugs into WSUS in the normal way, but is specifically used for the hosts and the virtual machines only, and is excluded from your normal WSUS solution. The next two are pretty much hand in glove, so dynamic optimization and power management. So the ability to move virtual machines based on performance or requirement has been something that Microsoft have not traditionally been particularly good at from a simplified point of view. So previously you've needed multiple products to provide the functionality. So it was a bit of Hyper-V, a bit of Virtual Machine Manager, a bit of Ops Manager, and it would actually be Ops Manager that would be doing the bulk of the heavy lifting. And what they've now done is they've transitioned that into Virtual Machine Manager. So dynamic optimization is built into the product, and I've got some screenshots a little later to show you what that looks like. But one of the big things, I mentioned custom properties earlier, the old process had no affinity built into it. So an Ops Manager decided that that host was overutilized and you needed to move a virtual machine in order to lighten the load. There was no logic built into that process. It would arbitrarily choose a virtual machine that was the best candidate, and it would move it. And if you got a deployment where you purposely separated virtual machines, they could actually end up on the same host, giving you a single point of failure. So the custom properties now allow me to build logic into the process, so we can stipulate that the virtual machine must match the host, should match the host, shouldn't match the host, or mustn't match the host. We've also got the flip side of dynamic optimization, which is power management, because do I want to be automatically load balancing every 15 minutes during non-production hours? So if you're not a 24/7 operation and you've got traditional quiet times, you don't want to be automatically load balancing. What you want to be doing is trying to do some sort of resource maximization and power management. And that's what we've got built into the product. So we've got the ability to load as many virtual machines onto as fewer pieces of tin as possible, and then power down the ones that are not required. And obviously there are thresholds and checks built into the process. And again, this uses the things like the HP ILO and the Dell DRAC in order to provide that capability. And as some of you may have seen from the Windows Server 2012 webinar, the cluster management has changed significantly, and there is now a lot more functionality built into the process, which means that we can move virtual machines and the virtual machine storage without actually incurring anywhere near as much downtime. We've also got the ability to do live migrations with no shared storage. We also bring into the concept private cloud. So this is something that's been bandied around for a number of years, and you ask different people and you'll get different explanations. But the whole principle here is the fact that because I've got the ability within Virtual Machine Manager to take my host, to take my virtual machines, to take the network fabric, to take the storage fabric and virtualize it, I can actually allocate those resources to a defined entity, and that defined entity is your cloud. And what that then gives me the ability to do is specify things like capacity and scalability. It also gives me the ability to stipulate ownership, and it also gives me the ability to delegate control and implement quotas on a service rather than a host and virtual machines. And that actually paves the way to having your own dedicated console, which we've got coming up a little bit later with application controller. We've also got the ability to bring in service management. So rather than taking a virtual machine and applying a template or templates that allow me to deploy a virtual machine quickly and easily, you've actually got the ability to take an entire solution and template it. So SQL backend, a web front end, a number of virtual machines, a load balancer, an IP address range, some shared storage, and actually deploy it as a solution. And that template is unique in the fact that any deployed service never loses the link to the template, which means that I can update the template and then I can then publish those changes out to everything that's deployed from it. So rather than having to manually duplicate lots of actions across lots of virtual machines, I can do that from a single location. And if you get it wrong, you've actually got the ability to revoke it, which is incredibly useful. So some of the screenshots that we talked about, we've got the ability, as we've said, to put in place things like the storage, so we get classifications and pools and providers and arrays. So I stipulate where they are, what they're doing, I interrogate it, I bring that information back, and I can allocate that to hosts or virtual machines. I've also got the ability, as we said, to create clouds, and we can see the services that are offered by the clouds. We've also got that dynamic optimization, so how frequently we're load balancing. We've also got the power optimization, so when I'm not automatically load balancing, what hours of the day can I look at resource maximization. So there's a lot of new stuff within Virtual Machine Manager 2012. And one of the things I touched on was app controller. So once I've actually created my private cloud and I want to give someone the ability to manage it from a delegated point of view, not full administration, there might be the service owner, not necessarily the actual service manager or the manager of the data center. I want to give them a console in order to be able to do that. So previously that's been done via a self-service web console on Virtual Machine Manager 2010. There were issues with that in the fact that you had to be a named owner of an individual virtual machine. So even though you were an administrator and you got full control over everything, if you were not the named owner of that virtual machine, it wouldn't appear within the console. So this is where the whole principle of creating the clouds come from, and then delegating control of the cloud. So I've got an overview where I can see my private clouds and the virtual machine managers that are plugged into this, and I can perform a number of actions. We've also got public cloud services, so if you're consuming anything from Windows Azure, we can also plug that into this particular console. I can see the clouds that I'm actually using, and what I can do is I can actually perform action. So this is all based upon role-based administrative control. So when I log into the app controller web page, it actually evaluates my rights and permissions within Virtual Machine Manager and only shows me the actions that I can actually perform. So from in here I could connect, or I could deploy a new cloud service. We could actually look at the services themselves, we can stop, we can start, and again this is all based upon my permissions, and my permissions might be different from Gary's permissions, who might be different from Brian's permissions, for example. We can also see our virtual machines and perform actions against those. We've also got access to things like library resources. There's also a list of jobs, so anyone that performs an administrative action is audited. So that gives me the ability to delegate control of my cloud. We really ought to be looking at monitoring, and that's where Operations Manager comes into it. So as we said, the power optimization and the dynamic organisation allows me to move and shut them down. But if I want to actually look at the performance workload of a cluster, or of a physical host, or a virtual machine, or more importantly the application workload within that virtual machine, Operations Manager is still the product to look at. There's been some significant changes with the 2012 release. So anyone that's got the old version of the product, they'll be used to the fact that we used to have something called management servers, and then there used to be something called a root management server. And if your root management server ever failed, you're in a whole world of pain. And if you'd not got the encryption key that was created when you first installed the product, you could effectively looking at building it again from scratch. So what they've now done is they've adopted sort of the Active Directory model. So rather than it being a single read-write and multiple read-onlys, all of the management servers are now read-write. So in the event of a failure, there's no great problems like there is with the previous version of the product. The other changes have come around three particular areas. So that is networking, that is monitoring of things like .NET applications, and that is of monitoring of things like Java runtime applications. So the .NET applications and the Java runtime applications, I actually set up a monitor that actually monitors the whole process from start to finish and back out again. So if you've got a web application, for example, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to look at monitoring that from the point of entry to the database on the back end to the point of exit again. And I'm continually gathering information and creating metrics that evaluate the process and try and identify where bottlenecks potentially occur. The whole thing with this is, developers create fantastic applications. They typically test it on kit that's far superior to the kit that's actually deployed in your infrastructure. So of course when they do their testing, it runs like you wouldn't believe. You put that out in a production environment and it's not necessarily the greatest thing that's ever been released. And then you start getting an argument between the admins and the developers with regards to what have you done to break it? It must be your infrastructure. Well, our infrastructure looks all right. It must be your code. So this is where we start to gather those metrics that actually makes that conversation significantly easier. And we can drill down and look at performance bottlenecks and to such a degree that we can actually identify an individual line of code that may be causing problems. So that makes that conversation between the administrators and the developers so much easier, rather than it's your infrastructure, no, it's your code. The other area of development around Operations Manager is network monitoring. And network monitoring traditionally has been a basic SNMP trap, and it'll go, yes, it's up, no, it's down. And that's realistically as much as you get out of it. So we've now got significant changes in there, so we can do connectivity, it will create you a virtual map, we can look at VLAN membership, we can look at the hotspot routing protocol groups, we can look at throughput on devices, so ports, interfaces, processors, memory, we can look at drops, discards, utilization, so on and so forth. So we can do a significant amount of in-depth monitoring on network infrastructure that we've never been able to do before. And we can look at providing those with metrics, we get a summary, we can keep that information for 13 months. So stuff that you've never been able to do with Microsoft before. We've then got Data Protection Manager, so if it's monitored and it's managed, you might want to look at backing it up. The changes that have come in with Data Protection Manager are to do with a hierarchy of Data Protection Manager servers. So previously the relationship was that you backed up to a single data protection manager server, and if you needed to spread the load and implement multiple data protection manager servers, they would all be standalone. So what we've now got the ability to do is plug that into a hierarchical console, and that allows me to do single management from a single point to multiple locations. So that's probably the biggest change in there. The other big change is how it backs up SharePoint. So in the previous version, it would back up SharePoint as a SQL database, some files and some stuff. And when you came to restore it, effectively you had to restore the whole thing and then have a look for the information that you required. We now actually back up SharePoint properly as an entire entity. I can take that SharePoint back up, I can mount it within the recovery console, and I can view the content and extract purely the data that I'm interested in. Okay. It also ties into things like Operations Manager significantly better than it did before, so we get better reporting and monitoring. And it also can plug into things like Service Manager, which we've got coming up in a bit, which allows me to do help desk and ticketing type things. So if there is a problem, we can create an incident immediately within a help desk product. So as I mentioned earlier on, Configuration Manager 2012 has probably changed the most with regards to how it delivers applications, but also with Service Pack 1. So traditionally, it's there to do inventorying of hardware and software, it's there to look at concurrent usage patterns, deliver software, deploy operating systems, patch, and vicariously it could do antivirus and anti-malware. That's now embedded, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to put the emphasis on delivering software to a user rather than to a device. And we can bring into the process device affinity, so we know what the user's primary device is, we know what their secondary and tertiary devices are, and we can tailor how the software distribution actually takes place based upon what device they're on. There's also logic built into the process, so if you ever deployed a piece of software with Configuration Manager and you inadvertently deploy the same piece of software to the same user again, it will actually try and do an installation and it will error and tell you that it can't install because it's already there. We now actually check to find out whether the product's actually there and go, it's actually not needed. There's also a software delivery modeling process, so you can actually create a use case or a scenario where we pretend to deploy a piece of software and then evaluate it. So there's a lot to go with that. There's also an app store, so we can actually publish applications on a web page. Users can go to that and actually say, I'd actually like that, install it please. And you can build change management into that process, so you can stipulate whether it can install without anybody having to approve it, or you can build approval into the process as well. So we mentioned that Service Pack 1 has been introduced and there's been some significant changes. So first significant change is probably the last bullet point for Configuration Manager, which is support for OS 10. So there is actually a client that you can install on your Macs and you can have them reporting into Configuration Manager. There is a caveat, you have to be using HTTPS in order for that to work, but this is significantly better than going out to somebody like Quest and buying a third-party product, which was significantly expensive and could only manage 200 Macs per Configuration Manager site. So there was some limitation. Now this is significantly better. We've also finding that there is now support for Windows 8, Server 2012. There's also support for apps for Windows 8. So that's the Windows 8 apps as opposed to the traditional ones. We've also got the ability to download from things like Windows Azure distribution points and also use things like restrict 3G and 4G network connections so that you're not deploying when you're on a metered connection so that you don't get stung for some charges on the data usage. There's also changes to endpoint protection. And endpoint protection now actually checks multiple times a day as opposed to a single time a day. You also get real-time information coming out of it rather than it being at 15-minute intervals based upon a VB script. You can also merge antivirus policies, which is a useful thing to do. One thing to mention with this as well, anyone that's got a Configuration Manager 2012 Service Pack 1 implementation, the licensing has been updated, and that licensing now includes a free Windows Intune subscription. So you manage the primary user's device by Configuration Manager, and then you can use Intune to manage 4 additional devices if you wish to do so. And it's purely the management side of it. It doesn't include the Windows 8 license. We've then got the Service Manager and Orchestrator, so these pretty much work, again, hand in glove. Service Manager is the help desk product, and Orchestrator is the process automation. So we can have things that report to Service Manager and create an incident. So let's say you've got Ops Manager monitoring. I can plug Ops Manager into Service Manager. Service Manager will create a ticket based on an alert generated by Ops Manager. I can then hand that off to Orchestrator, so the Orchestrator runs through what's referred to as a run book and actually provides the corrective action. Ops Manager then reports that everything is okay, and Service Manager then closes the ticket. That's a bit glib. There is a lot of configuration required around the background in order to make this work, but it does work. This is a fully ITIL compliant. One of the big things around ITIL is obviously you need a change management database to start. So Service Manager can actually provide you that. So as we say, we've got the process automation. It gives me the ability to populate a CMDB, and it also gives us a customer-facing website stroke help desk function where users can log calls or see incidents or make service requests. So the actual change management database has always been a big thing to create. So Service Manager does that by allowing me to plug into things like Active Directory, so it'll pull out information on users, computers, printers, groups, shares, domain controllers, so on and so forth. It will populate that. We can then plug it into the other systems in order to rationalize that. So Configuration Manager will tell me about the device history, the inventory. Operations Manager will tell me about the alert. So one of the big things that is a challenge for most people adopting an ITIL practice is creating that change management database. Service Manager will effectively do that automatically for you by plugging it into the relevant objects. And then, as I say, we can then plug that into Orchestrator to do process automation, or you can have it so that we offer service requests. User requests a new service, and then that triggers a ticket to be created. Service Manager runs a run book, and the ticket gets closed once the process is completed successfully. Or it could be installation of software. It could be pretty much anything. You can automate near enough everything with the Orchestrator. So that's the product overview. I've touched on licensing already, but we'll run through this reasonably quickly. But it is very important to understand. So it's designed to work specifically with Windows Server and Windows Server licensing. So it's private cloud optimized and it's simplified. So if you look at the old version of System Center, there was probably in excess of 60 SKUs and the licensing was incredibly complex. There are now 5 licenses that you buy, 2 that apply to servers and 3 that apply to workstations. So looking at where we used to be, we used to have a client management license. They're still valid. We used to have a server management license. They're still valid. But more importantly, we used to have license our back-end infrastructure. So the actual devices that were doing the management of the workstations and the devices that were doing the management of the servers typically needed their own license, and they typically also needed a SQL license for the database that they stored their information in. When the product goes to 2012, a fairly large chunk of the cost of that implementation has been removed by the fact that the back-end infrastructure no longer has a license requirement. Don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that you can then use the SQL implementation in order to run your production web servers or database applications from. The restriction is the fact that the database is limited to the System Center information, but we don't need to license that back-end infrastructure. Effectively, we buy the correct number of client management licenses or we buy the correct number of server management licenses and you're good to go. In fact, in order to try and identify that slightly more depth for you, we've got the 2 server license SKUs that you would have. So System Center standard, I apply to the physical server I would like to manage. It allows me to install all 8 products on that physical server and manage that server using those 8 products, and 2 virtual machines, providing the host hasn't got more than 2 CPUs. If we exceed 2 CPUs or we exceed 2 virtual machines, I can implement multiple standard licenses. However, doing that becomes cost ineffective reasonably quickly. Round about 6 virtual machines on the same host, and data center becomes significantly more cost effective. Similar in the fact that you can install all 8 products on the physical server and the virtual machines. It covers 2 processors, but more importantly, it covers the unlimited number of virtual machines. So as you can see, those of you familiar with Windows Server licensing, this pretty much works hand in hand. And that's my usual rule of thumb when it comes to working out your licensing. Whatever Windows Server licensing you've got deployed, you apply the same System Center license to that server, and you're not going to go far wrong. So just to emphasize the point again, management servers, we don't need to be licensed. The servers that you are managing need to be licensed, but that's on a physical server point of view, and you get the virtual machine use rights. The client management licenses are very much on an OSE basis, so therefore physical servers, or sorry, physical workstations or VDI. Couple of examples. So if you've got 2 servers, physical servers, they're not virtualized in any way, shape or form. We would require 2 standard licenses for that. You could apply 2 data center licenses, but that would be overkill. If you've got a single server with 4 processors, but again you're not virtualizing, again that would need 2 standard because you've tripped the 2 CPU value. And it's very important that we're talking about CPUs, we're talking about sockets, we are not talking about cores. Okay. Example number 3, I've got 1 server. That 1 server is running 3 virtual machines. So again, that would be 2 standard licenses or 1 data center. But if we went above that, as you can see with the example 4, where we've got a single server and we're running 8 virtual machines, you either buy 4 standard licenses or you buy a single data center, and that's when data center realistically comes into its own. For those of you who have software assurance, there is a migration path, and to be honest, you're better off contacting in order to get details on that, because that depends on what product that you've got, and we have to work through a use case scenario in order to establish. But if you have got the luxury of software assurance in the old version of the product, you will get a licensing grant to move to the newer version of the product. As an example, the licensing transition, so individual licenses, so if anyone's got the SMSD or SMSE, there's a ratio for that. The licenses for the old version, for the management licenses, strictly speaking, is a one-to-one type of relationship. So there's some good examples to look at on there. And then finally, we've got the client licensing. So the client licensing, as I say, there are 3. So configuration manager is still standalone. So if I want to do operating system deployment or patch management or software distribution, I still need a configuration manager license on a user or a device basis. If I then want to plug in anti-malware to that, I can then buy my endpoint protection. And the reason those 2 are separate is the configuration manager one is a perpetual license, whereas the endpoint one is a subscription, which is why you have to purchase them separately. If you want your workstations, desktops, laptops, whatever you want to call them, to participate in any other System Center product, then you need to buy a client management suite license, again on a per user or per device basis. Okay. One last thing, for those of you who don't know, there is actually a ability to buy Windows Server and System Center as a single line item, and this is referred to as the core infrastructure suite. For more details on that, if you contact the guys at Environ, they'll be happy to advise. Thank you very much. I'll pass you back to Gary.
Thank you, Sean. That was very interesting and informative. Environ specialises in providing solutions that meet our customers' exacting needs using this technology, and we very much hope that if you found this instruction useful and would like to have a further conversation, you'll be in touch. Additionally, you may like to know that we have a highly specified demonstration centre in which this and other technologies can be demonstrated, and we have an active programme of learning events where you'll have the opportunity to speak directly to members of our engineering team and partners. Please take a look at www.environ.co.uk/events for further information. So many thanks for watching.